Whenever the Georgian language is brought up, it's not unlikely that something is said about its split ergativity along some tense aspect boundaries, meaning that in some verb conjugations it displays nominative accusative alignment, and in some conjugations it is ergative absolutive. More on what that means later. However, this isn't quite correct because of an interesting class of verbs. In this video, I will talk a bit about modern Georgian's verbs, explain what a case marking or alignment system is, and characterize the case marking of Georgian's Aorist series, which is often said to display ergativity. Modern Georgian verbs are known for being pretty complicated. They are polypersonal, marking the person and number of the direct object and/or existence and person of a potential indirect object. The modern verb has many conjugations, dubbed screeves, that denote tense aspect and modal meanings. We have a present tense, a past imperfective, a past subjunctive, a future, a conditional or past frequentative, a future subjunctive, an aorist past or imperative, an optative, a present perfect, and a pluperfect. Now you might have noticed that these forms are grouped into three groups or series. There are a few reasons why this is canonical. It reflects the order in which these developed, with Series 2 developing first, followed by Series 1, and then finally 3. It reflects itself in the verbal morphology displayed during conjugation. Series 1 and sometimes 3 can have thematic suffixes that don't appear in Series 2. Series 1 and 2 have pre-radical version vowels that are not distinguished in Series 3. Series 3 exhibits subject-object inversion in its noun agreement. I could go on. But most importantly to this video, verbs conjugated in different series demand different case marking systems for the nouns involved. If you've studied a language like German or Russian, you'll know what a case system is. It is the inflection of a noun or adjective to agree with its function. In English, we do this sort of declension in our pronouns. I see her, but she sees me. The forms of the first and third person pronouns change based on whether they are the subject or direct object of a sentence. Indo-European languages tend to be nominative accusative, where what we call the subject of an intransitive verb and the subject of a transitive verb are marked in a nominative case, and the direct object of a transitive verb is marked with a different case, often called the accusative. So the I in the intransitive I hide, and the transitive I hide her is the same. But this is not the only way that semantic cases can work. To explain this, we'll need to refine our terminology a bit. In English, we have a concept of a subject, object, and indirect object of a clause. I'm not going to go too into detail on what these are because you probably know already, and formal definitions aren't too important here. But because we never distinguish between the subject of an intransitive verb and the subject of a transitive verb in case, as I said, I hide and I hide her, the I is the same, we also don't typically use distinct terms for those two arguments. We call them both the subject. But because in some other languages a distinction is made between those two arguments, we need to come up with different names for these different concepts. It's more standard to keep calling the subject of an intransitive verb the subject of a transitive verb the agent, and the object of a transitive verb the object. So for the purposes of a nominative accusative language, our English terminology works fine because the subject and agent are marked the same. But in an ergative case marking system, as you probably guessed, this is actually not true, and rather the subject of an intransitive and the object of a transitive are marked identically with an absolutive case, while the agent, or subject, of a transitive verb is marked with a tense called the ergative tense. So we would say I hide, but herg hides I, for ergative third-person pronoun herg and absolutive first-person I. So again, the crux to understanding ergativity is to understand that there's no canonical reason that the subject of an intransitive verb and what we'd call the subject of a transitive verb should be considered as the same thing, and similarly that there is no canonical reason that they should be governed by the same case. This really isn't so complicated as it might sound. If you still don't understand, then there are some other videos about this concept. You can watch Artifician's or David Peterson's if you want. So, to talk about the case system of Georgian, there are 7 cases in total, but only 3 semantic cases to worry about: the nominative, the dative, and the narrative, which is often called the ergative in English language literature, but I'll be saying narrative because it's more neutral. I said that the case marking system differed in Georgian based on the series of the screeve of the verb. Indeed, the semantic functions of nouns standing in these cases is determined by the series of the verb to which they belong. So, let's look at how this happens, starting with the first series. This is also called the present series, although it contains future and past imperfective conjugations as well as the simple present. Any present or future tense indicative forms are denoted using the present or future form of this series, and the past imperfective conjugation also belongs to the present series, which is distinguished from the perfective aorist past tense in Series 2 and the perfect and pluperfect past tenses in Series 3. It also has a conditional which is used quite frequently and can also function as a past frequentative, just like English constructions with would, and present and future subjunctive conjugations which are not quite so common. They're mostly used for counterfactual statements, so the Series 2 optative is used much more commonly than these, despite what you might think based on their name. So if you want to say I am doing, I will do, I was doing, I would do, if I were doing, or if I would do, then you would probably use a verb in Series 1. But that's just some context for the linguists among you. If we look at how case marking works for screeves in this series, we see that the subject stands in the nominative, the agent stands in the nominative, and the direct object stands in the dative. It is not shown here, but the indirect object also stands in the dative. I'm not going to show any more examples, so please trust me when I say this case marking is generally true. While a textbook nominative accusative language might mark direct and indirect objects in a different case, this still fits the bill of a nominative accusative alignment. Now let's take a look at Series 2. The ergative hypothesis as it applies to Georgian is that Georgian second series verb conjugations are ergative, and you'll often hear people characterize the Georgian language as having split ergativity, wherein the Aorist series, or Series 2, is of ergative alignment and the other two series are of nominative accusative alignment. I'm sure you've gathered already that this may not be the whole story, so let's look at a couple examples. There are only two screeves in Series 2, which is also called the Aorist series because it contains the aorist past tense. This is just a perfective aspect past tense which is not perfect. Also in this series is the optative, which is used in expressions of desire or possibility. So let's look at a simple example. We have the verb dalevs, to drink, and its passive counterpart, daileva, to be drunk. Dalevs is a pretty standard verb. It is transitive, as the drinker is the subject and the drinkee is the object. And we can say it has an active voice because the man, the drinker, the final subject, has control over the action. Its intransitive counterpart, daileva, is intransitive and has a passive voice because the subject, the drinkee, is not the one in control of that action. The idea of active versus passive voice will be important later on. I'm skipping the more formal definition, but hopefully it's clear. So in our example sentences with these verbs, we have the object water of the first sentence marked with the same case as the subject water of the intransitive sentence in the nominative, and the agent, man, standing in the narrative. So far, this looks like the standard ergative system, but there are some more verb types to look at than just active and passive. Georgian also has a lot of verbs that function like those Germanic dative constructions, often to do with feelings, saying something like, it is lovely to me, instead of, I love it. These verbs are intransitive and can be monopersonal, like, he is cold, stiva, but are often bipersonal, like, momts ons, it is likable to me, or uchirs, meaning he has difficulty with it, or it is difficult to him. These verbs have a sort of medial voice, which is a voice between active and passive, wherein the subject is not really acting on anything and is not being acted upon. Love or being cold is not really an action. But they are also sort of passive in that the grammatical subject doesn't really have control over the action. Rather, the indirect object does. Thus, these verbs are often called medio-passive. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of active, passive, medial, and all that shenanigans. Hopefully it's clear enough what they are. And we can look at the case marking in this last example. Hats daleva moets ona. Literally, drinking was likable to the man. Remember that because the man is an indirect rather than a direct object, this sentence is intransitive, and to confirm ergativity, we want the subject of this sentence, which is the verbal noun drinking, daleva, to be marked in the same case as the object of transitive verbs and the subject of intransitives, which is the nominative, as we've seen with the active verbs so far. This is true, but it might leave you with some questions. Indeed, you might be wondering why drinking is considered the subject rather than an indirect object of the sentence. It may seem like I assumed what I proved by using the case marking to determine what the subject is and then comparing the subject with the case marking to determine ergativity. While going into why exactly these ideas of subject and object are correct is far outside the scope of this video, I can try to give some intuition as to why the subjects are indeed marked in the nominative. The first is that these dative constructions are relatively common in languages. Again, we can look at German, he loves it, where the nominative it is considered the subject in the same way that the Georgian verb ukvars. Further, as I've claimed, in the Georgian first series we have that the subject is always marked in the nominative, and this can be a good way to determine what the subject is in the same way that we do in languages with more consistent case marking like English or German. Outside of this intuition, I'll just claim that drinking is indeed the subject, and thus that these sorts of verbs act ergatively in the Aorist series, and I might do a video on subjects and indirect objects in Georgian sometime later, since it's pretty darn interesting. Now, so far we've seen examples of active, passive, and mediopassive verbs, which all seem to act ergatively. But the heretofore unshown medioactive verbs do exist. Remember, the medio refers to a medial voice that is between active and passive in that the subject is not really acting on anything or being acted upon. But the active refers to the idea that the subject is indeed in control of the action, unlike the mediopassive verbs that we saw in the last section. There are some transitive medioactive verbs like to speak or to play, where you can speak words or play football, but most of them are intransitive, like to dance or to sing or to run. So just to over-explain, the verb to run is intransitive because it has only one argument, the subject, the runner. It is medial because the subject isn't really acting on anything, but it's also not being acted upon. But it is medioactive because it is in control of the action, the running that is taking place. The transitive medioactive verbs like to play, tamashoba, display ergativity with the agent in the narrative case and the object in the nominative. But if we look at an intransitive medioactive verb in the aorist tense like sekvavs, to dance, we see that it also takes its subject in the narrative. This is true for all intransitive medioactive verbs, so it turns out that medioactive verbs, regardless of their transitivity, take their subjects in the narrative in Series 2. I'll zoom out a bit and talk about why this is interesting. So I've given you examples of 4 types of verbs: transitive or active, passive, medioactive, and mediopassive. This wasn't just arbitrary. In fact, Georgian verbs can be pretty neatly divided into precisely these 4 groups, not only in syntax and semantics, as we've discussed, but also in morphology. This means that, for example, active transitive verbs all look and conjugate similarly to each other and differently from the other groups, in addition to the other differences. If you ever find yourself studying Georgian, these are the 4 basic conjugation types that you'll see. Historically, these groups have been called transitive, intransitive, medioactive, and mediopassive, but in the modern day they're often called the more ambiguous class 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is because in any complete natural language, there are bound to be some exceptions. For example, the verb amtknaribs, to yawn, is intransitive, but morphologically and syntactically acts like the class 1 verbs, and thus belongs to that group anyways, so people don't want to call the class 1 verbs transitive because of such exceptions. But anyways, the reason I'm telling you this is that those medioactive verbs, which are mostly intransitive and do not display ergativity, but rather are a large class of verbs within the Georgian conjugation system that is semantically, morphologically, and syntactically cohesive. So it's very difficult to just chalk the fact that these verbs do not display ergativity up to irregularity. Arguing that these verbs are irregular would be based only on the fact that they behave differently from class 1 and 2 verbs because of how consistently these guys behave. And so this class's conjugation is a real problem for the ergative Georgian hypothesis. The theory that most appeals to me is that the Aorist series of Georgian is not of ergative alignment, but rather exhibits active case marking. So again, an ergative system is one which distinguishes transitive verbs, which have an agent and an object, from intransitive verbs, which have a subject, wherein the case of the subject is the same as the case of the object, conventionally called the absolutive, and is different from that of the agent, which stands in the ergative. In contrast, an active case marking system distinguishes active intransitive verbs, passive intransitive verbs, and transitive verbs, which are always active. One case, which we might as well call the absolutive, governs the subject of passive verbs and the object of transitive verbs, and another case, let's say ergative, governs the subject of active verbs, intransitive and transitive. Note that the only difference between an active and ergative system is the case marking on the subject of active intransitive verbs. In the former, it is ergative, and in the latter, it is nominative. And remember that the big exception to the characterization of Georgian's Aorist series as an ergative system was the intransitive class 3 verbs, which are active. Thus, Georgian's Aorist series indeed fits this mold of an active case marking system rather than an ergative one. You can look back through the examples previously given to confirm this. So I'll finish up with a short note. This case in Georgian is not called ergative, but Introbiti, which translates to narrative. As we've seen, this case is only used with the second or Aorist series of screeves, which notably includes the past aorist tense, which is often used, of course, when telling a story. So the name narrative case is so named because it is the case that is used to advance the narrative of a story. That's pretty sick.